Okay, world history, we are going to talk about the old world system. Your essay prompt says white supremacists embrace a Eurocentric narrative that credits the West as the origin of civilization and the singular creative force propelling the development of our modern worldview. So, this is the Eurocentric view of world history. And your essay prompt is to use your knowledge of the old world system to challenge this interpretation of history. So, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we mean by the old world system, how it relates to Southernization, which you guys have read about and pulled some evidence from to identify why it's important, and also to get you ready to read tonight about Janet Abu Lagod makes an argument for why the West, for an alternative narrative to this Eurocentric narrative. She presents another narrative. And so this is sort of getting you ready to read that assignment. So let's figure out what's wrong with this Eurocentric narrative. We're going to dig into this a little bit more and try to understand what it is. And we're going to use our knowledge of the old world system. We're going to build our knowledge of the old world system. So here, I'm going to hide this first. So what is this Eurocentric narrative that you're trying to combat? We've talked about it some, right? But we want to think about this story, this single story that it tells about who and what is important in history. And what this narrative says is the origins of the modern world. We're going to look at why it's Eurocentric, and we're also going to look at how it relates to the reading that you're going to do tonight, this weekend. So, according to this Eurocentric narrative, the first Westerners, remember by the West, we mean Western Europe, and then its culture that spread to the United States and Canada and other places that are European, that were colonized by Europeans. So, the argument is that the first Westerners were the ancient Greeks and Romans, and that what distinguishes the modern world from the ancient world is what divides the West from the East. And by the East, we mean China, we mean India, we mean the Middle East, all those places. And we also, in some ways, mean Africa, although Africa gets completely left out of this narrative. But the idea is that men, the supremacy of mind in the affairs of men, this is a quote from Abu Lugod, came to birth in Greece and lived in Greece alone of all the ancient world. So it's this idea that Greece and Rome constructed a Western civilization. So, and that they're the first people with civilization and culture. They're the first democracy. They're the first truly modern society. And we could actually spend a lot of time on why this is actually incorrect in and of itself. But it's important to understand that this is the view, this Eurocentric view. This is where white supremacists are sort of coming from. Then the argument says that with the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe sort of entered a dark age. And Western Europe became lost all this wonderful culture and economic energy that had come from the Roman Empire. And that's what we mean by the Dark Ages. And then, and this is really important for what you guys have been already collecting evidence for, the Renaissance comes between the 1400s and 1600s, and the Renaissance and the Age of Exploration is the rise of Europe's cultural, artistic, political, and economic rebirth and rise to global dominance. And so Europe is just like, woohoo, got huge. And it seems like it came out of nowhere in this Eurocentric model. It's like this Dark Ages happened, and then somehow Europeans, because they're so amazing, developed all this amazing art. Here's this evidence of the art of the Sistine Chapel. Columbus, quote unquote, discovered America, and all this great, glorious development arose. So the essay prompt is saying that this is a problem and that we have evidence that challenges this narrative, and we want you to be able to explain how. And so you're going to do this in two ways. And that's what those two arguments you've already been pulling evidence for gets at. One is that we're going to tell a different narrative, a more global story, a more global narrative of Europe's rise to global dominance. They clearly didn't do it on their own or out of nowhere. Nothing comes out of nowhere. So trying to better explain why Europe rose and became as dominant as it is today. And also, very importantly, showing that there's nothing special about Europeans that allowed them to rise, that there were all these other regions of the world that had the same characteristics of innovation, of creativity, of artistic flowering, that this is true all over the world. And Europe is not special. And then that means that it wasn't inevitable that Europe was going to take over the world. And this is where Abu Lughod gets to, that's going to be really important. Okay? So, why does it look to Western Europeans like the rise of the West happened out of nowhere? Why did historians sort of develop this narrative? And Abu Lughod, who you're going to read in a part that you're not going to read, but you can if you want, it's on page 48 of your reading packet, says that Western scholars, European scholars began their history in 1400. And remember that Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, and that the Renaissance was already happening in the 1400s. By 1450, the Renaissance had already taken off in Europe. And so it's saying that by starting their history in 1400, this is a place where both the East and the West were at their low point. So it's right before the West rose, but it's also a point where that system that we've been looking at of Southernization had started to break down. And so that world, that glorious trade and development and spread of ideas that we saw of the Muslims and that we've seen in India and that we've hinted at China, but we're going to look at more, had just collapsed. And so it looks to these historians as if the West did rise out of nowhere because it came out of this moment in time. They're looking at the wrong moment. They're looking at 1400. So this is how, I think this is a really good point about history, that history isn't just about like people wanting to tell a different narrative, but sometimes people just asking the wrong questions, historians asking the wrong questions, looking in the wrong place, not taking into account a larger picture. And so Abu Lughod says, what if we go earlier? And she comes up with an alternative hypothesis, a different reason for why Europe rose, and it pushes back on this idea that Europe rose independently. She claims, again, on page 48, that Europe's rise was assisted by what it learned from other more advanced cultures. This should sound super familiar to you. Because she agrees with Linda Schaefer, the Southernization author. These two historians, their stories go together. She's saying, just like Linda Schaefer is, she's saying that the South Asian culture, the culture from India and China that was spread by the Muslims, is really, really important for why Europe was able to rise. So instead, she says, start in the 13th century, which is the 1200s. And that, remember, is where Linda Schaefer was looking too. And so we have this map of the 13th century, this old world system here. And what these circles are what she calls these different circuits of the 13th century world system. And you can see they're color coded, right? So you've got Northwest Europe, South Europe. You've got the Mongol Empire. We haven't really looked at the Mongols as much, but you saw them on your evidence slides. You've got the Middle East. You have this trade in Egypt. And she doesn't have that circle here, but we also know that the gold salt trade is also really important here. So you have Africa linked in here. You have Africa linked in here. And then we also are going to get this other Indian Ocean trade that Linda Schaefer talks about here. So these circuits are really important. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but what I want, because I think that Linda Schaefer does it for you, but one thing that you guys are going to want to think about is that she says that Europe, Northwest Europe was in a dark age, but this whole area was super not in a dark age. It was absolutely developing and spreading ideas and spreading technologies, and that those things were linked into one area of Europe that wasn't in a dark age, which is this area right here. Notice that this system of trade and this system of trade link up right here in Italy. And she says this area is really, really important. And I think it's significant to understand, as a European history teacher too, that the Renaissance starts here. And she says, well, that's not a coincidence, because this area was already linked into all of this stuff. So they were getting these developments here. She also emphasizes that this links to that this area becomes important a little bit later, right? So we have Spain is actually part of the Middle Eastern circuit that is and the Muslim circuit that is arising. But that South Europe, which she sort of circles here, this whole area here, is also linked in to the Middle East. Okay. I think that is all you need to do the reading tonight, to really understand the reading tonight. As you are reading, I did this as a video because as you are reading, if you are confused about things she's saying, you've got this map here. And you've also got your Southernization maps that you worked on as well that can help you. Remember that China, these circles are going to help you. And when she circles it, she's circling that this is not the country of China, but instead that this is a system of trade that is coming out of China. So China is trading with these areas. And you can see how they're all linked, right? So the Chinese are trading here, and that links to the Eastern Indian trade here, and that Eastern Indian trade links to the Western Indian trade here, and that Western Indian trade links to lots of things. Notice again how the Middle East connects all these things. It connects the Mongols, it connects West India, it connects the Egyptian and North Eastern African trade, and it connects, importantly, Southern Europe, and that Southern Europe then connects Northwest Europe. So the idea of these overlapping places is this is where that trade is happening. This is where exchange is happening. This is where people are learning from each other. Okay. I'm hoping that helps you guys with your reading tonight.